Good morning. I am Toni Sveom and I am Plan B. And it is, it's quite amazing to think about how this all came to be. I didn't plan coming here and, falling into this role, but it is really fascinating how it all came together. So I'm going to open us with prayer simply because, and I was going to explain for those who are on Zoom, our speaker has not yet arrived or is not going to arrive. So I am Plan B simply because we're going to do what we can to speak the subject from a non-native perspective, but based on information that I think is pretty sound. So let's open with prayer so that God will guide me in organizing my thoughts, in blessing your ears, and in guiding our discussion about this incredibly important topic of land, relationship, covenants broken, and the wealth that we share and prosperity that we have, and our finding out our role in how we can somehow make repair. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. It's pretty serendipitous for me to think about the book that I am currently engaged in reading. I am only halfway through this book, but it is absolutely what we need to be talking about. It's packed with all of that information. I was struck this morning by the gospel story of the book that was found. And that book that was found was a book of covenants, and how that ties into what we're going to be talking about with regard to Native people. The story of why I'm up here as Plan B right now goes like this. For those of you who don't know me, I am absolutely enthralled with doing family history research. There is an organization out in the East called American Ancestors. I have been on their list for a very long time. And what they do is offer webinars, both that can be taken for a price and those that are free. 2 or 3 weeks ago, I listened to an interview that was being done with Rebecca Clarren on this free webinar. And I was totally taken by what she had to say and her goal in the book that she was writing. She is a fabulous researcher and writer who happens to be Jewish. The title of the book is The Cost of Free Land. And what she has chosen to do through this book is weave the history of her relatives who left the oppression of Eastern Europe pogroms to come to the US for free land, opportunity to leave that oppressive situation and get out from under that and prosper in the new country. So that said, you now know that her relatives came from Eastern Europe. They got free land in South Dakota from the government, and they built their ranches, and then others of within her Russian family or her Jewish family, then built businesses in the Black Hills. What I am going to do is bring up points that she has provided in the book. But what we're going to do then is I'm going to draw out from you what you already know, because I'm not going to sit up here or stand up here and dispense information that you may already know about. So you're going to have to draw upon those who are in my era. You're going to have to draw upon the interesting history of Indigenous people that we were provided when we were youngsters in school. And then hopefully add to that what you now realize as adults through further reading and information that has been gathered. Basically, I'm going to start by saying everything that was done by the government to intentionally rip away culture, tradition, spirituality, all of that, of course, is within culture, was very intentional. And to read the details of it is very painful. It's very painful to know what was being done in the name of government. So the first thing that Rebecca Clarren talks about is the killing of the buffalo. So now I open up to you. What do you know about that process? What do you know about the buffalo at the time? What do you know about the relationship between Native people and the buffalo? I don't need to tell you, you know a lot of that. So go ahead and let me know what you know.
Well, they used every part of the buffalo.
Every part of the buffalo was used by the Indigenous folks. Absolutely.
A cowboy from Texas who was moving cattle said he watched for 2 days while the buffalo went by. There were so many of them. It took 2 days for them to pass where he was.
You are exactly right. There were millions and millions of buffalo that were available to the Native population. And one thing we know about the Native culture is that everything not only was used, but they didn't kill more than they needed. And that provision was God-given, the buffalo and all of its, all being able to be used.
I remember reading about train hunts from the train. So white folks would get on the train and they would go by buffalo herds and just shoot them from the train and leave them there.
Scott was saying that there was the buffalo hunt that was done by white people on the train as they were going by. There is a photograph in this book that I'm reading. Oh, I didn't even tell you that. Did I tell you?
Yeah.
It's called The Cost of Free Land. So that's Rebecca Clarren's book. There is one photograph with buffalo skulls piled up a couple stories high, and someone standing on top of the buffalo skulls, and he was not Native. Let's put it that way. The next thing I would like to ask you about is, what do you know about treaties that were written between the government and the Indigenous population? see if you can conjure up in your mind.
There was an 1835 treaty that the government put into place. And sometime in the late 1900s, it was challenged. I worked with the office that was defending the treaty. And we lost that treaty.
For those online, just so you know, I'm moving the.
They heard it.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, they're picking up off of this mic here.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
keep going. Pardon me for.
We can hear back here, they can hear it, yep.
Okay,
We can't hear. All I know is that, sorry. No idea.
Oh, I apologize, Tony. We would like it, used mic back,
Okay.
I guess.
because I know she's got something very important to say.
That treaty was challenged by
And remind us of the year so they can, the year.
the treaty of 1835.
1835.
Between an understanding between the government and the Native Americans. It went to court and was challenged. And we lost.
Who's we?
The treaty is in place.
We as in the native population, no, we as in the,
Yes,
yeah, and is that the treaty that was in the courts for about 100 years or more?
well, I didn't work for the office that long.
Because it seems to me that there was an issue that was in place for over 100 years. And that it was it's being resolved, and I think that the resolution included some payment. And the indigenous population said, we don't want payment. We just, I believe it was the Black Hills area, wasn't it? Or maybe not. I think, because I was going to ask later about the Black Hills, what you know about the Black Hills. So yes, there are people who are, or talk about the native population patients. If we're talking about the same issue, it was over 100 years of working with the government. Anything else about treaties?
There was a treaty in here in Minnesota, I don't know the year. But when they relinquished land up around Lake Mille Lacs and Leech Lake in that area, that the Native Americans retained the right to hunt and fish.
Mhm.
And back in I think it was the 1970s, a bunch of fishermen hunters wanted to challenge that because the Native Americans could hunt deer all year round
Correct.
and could take as many fish out of Lake Mille Lacs as they could use. And the hunters thought that that wasn't fair. And so they took it to court and they lost. As Sharon just said about the other treaties, that the treaty was signed by somebody official enough that the treaty held, and to this day, as far as I know, the Native Americans are able to net fish in Lake Mille Lacs and Leech Lake as much as they need.
Right. So I don't know if I'm going to recap that as well as Chris actually spoke it outright, but the folks in the native population in the Mille Lacs area, I believe they're Ojibwe, and they are able to net and do any fishing they want at any time throughout the year, whereas that is not the same for non-natives. And the non-native population chose to, or as a group of people chose to challenge that finding or that ruling, and it didn't come to fruition for them.
As I understand it, the tribes have a equivalent to the DNR commissioner. That's in their best interest to keep that fishery healthy.
Mhm.
So they within their tribal association govern when and how much fish can be taken from Leech Lake and
Leech
Red
Lake.
Lake and
Yep,
Mille Lacs, and so it's not that they're just wantonly destroying the fishery, but they're harvesting what they need and
exactly. And for those who don't know about the Department of Natural Resources, it is their job to make sure that we're not completely eradicating any fish population, animal population. It is their job to make certain that we are being frugal and careful about the resources, the natural resources that we have with fish and animals. Yes, go ahead.
On Leech Lake too, when we were up there this last year, they do the same thing with wild rice, that they come and they bring a whole bunch of people and they do it in a very fun manner, but you know, it's very organized and.
Yes, Leech Lake rice, wild rice harvesting. And yes, that is definitely the ritual around that is very, very much a part of the population, the native population. Anything else that you know about with regard to treaties? Go ahead.
Those are very positive, but most of them ended with this is for forever, but it wasn't the case. And most of the time they were broken and the Indians were given land for a certain period of time. And then when the whites wanted that land, they were moved out and the treaties meant nothing, even though they said this would go on forever.
I appreciate that you're able to understand how many treaties were not only not followed through, but if they weren't in the language that the native population understood, or were dealing with arm twisting in order to get the folks to sign these treaties, it is a very sad statement of what our government, how our government was treating the native population at that time. I mean, still, it's still there. Native peoples are constantly working to make certain that rights are in place.
There's a movie out, Martin Scorsese, Killers of the Flower Moon. Fantastic, beautiful, movie making, but tells a just deeply disturbing story of the history of this country. And the Indians at the time in the Potawatomi, who were from sort of like Kansas, Missouri, very fertile agricultural land. They were put on a reservation in that area, and then, that was more closer to their ancestral home grounds. Okay, they're on a reservation, and then, we might want that land. It seems to be pretty productive farmland. We're going to put you on this other reservation in the middle of Oklahoma, far from your ancestral lands, not nearly as productive, pretty barren, except it had oil. And they didn't know that at the time, right? And so they established a reservation for him in Oklahoma. Well, then they're the government is sort of stuck because oil gets discovered and all of the oil interests in the United States come in and develop that. So they start paying the rights and the native population, or the native that live on this reservation, which is not their ancestral land, begin to become rather wealthy. But the sort of like typical, white person story, which is, we got to get our money back somehow. So they figure out, so there, all of these capitalistic systems come into play that just, they're selling them cars, they're selling them things that they don't need nor necessarily want, but they convince them that they should have them. Lots of white people moved there to be servants to these rich native, recipients of all of this oil revenue, land lease money, but it was all managed by white people. If you wanted to get your money, you had to go see your agent, and the agent was a white person who was there to make sure you weren't going to spend your money foolishly. Never mind buying super wealthy, expensive cars and furs and glamorous dresses and all of this stuff. It's absurd how all that money just came back into the white economy as a result, right? And there are many more stories. I commend the movie to you. I'm sure it's based on a book. I know it is.
It is.
I haven't
Yeah,
seen
and
it.
it's a true story.
I haven't seen the movie, but the book is
Yeah,
very good.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
book is very
So,
readable.
but the movie, I'm a fan of cinema, so like the movie is really well done. So,
And
anyway,
remind me the name of the
it's
movie.
Killers of the Flower Moon,
Killers of the Flower Moon.
Yeah.
Is that the
and it's in the
same-
theaters right now.
Oh. Okay,
Yes,
that is-
Martin Scorsese.
I was going to ask if that was also the Trail of Tears, folks.
No,
No.
That wasn't Trail of
No,
Tears.
I think it's the Potawatomi.
The Potawatomi, okay.
In the cost of free land, there's a map of North and South Dakota,
Mhm.
and it shows treaties from different times in the 1800s,
Yep.
as you mentioned. And the lines show the original treaty, and then the next treaty and how it made smaller area, and then a third treaty and a fourth treaty. There are a few reservations scattered in South Dakota, and it just gives the breakdown, and the shaded areas are the last of the treaties, which show where the reservations ended up. And smaller groupings were isolated and placed in those areas.
And any land in that area that was farmable, that was tillable, became land that was advertised by the government as free land. So people from Europe, and there are relatives, they are our relatives. Now, in this particular book, Rebecca Clarren is of Jewish descent. And as I told you at the beginning, her family was leaving the oppressiveness of Eastern Europe at the time. And she, in this book, talks about the incredible tension that she felt as offspring 3 generations down from her relatives who took advantage of the free land that was available to them. And this free land, of course, according to the map, you can see how it was just whittled down time and time again. And part of this particular book and area of land is the Black Hills. And so now I'm going to skip what I wrote down as I was in worship at the end, realizing I was going to talk with you. I'm going to ask you, what do you know about the Black Hills? Because the Black Hills are within these parameters of treaty governments from the government treaties, and how that land just became less and less and less for the native population. What do you know about the Black Hills?
I just kind of want to go back to
Go
that.
back, okay.
The gist of what we're kind of saying is that we wish maybe the Native Americans would have had a more restrictive immigration policy. And if we talk about immigration going forward, we kind of come down and say, you know, Christians, we should be more lenient about immigration. So how do we balance that out?
Do you want to address that, Pastor? I'm Plan B.
Yeah, great. I mean, those are related, right? And lots of, you're familiar with the phrase memes. A lot of memes out on the internet where playing up that idea that our native brothers and sisters are just looking at us saying, you know, whenever you know, a Northern European who's been here a few generations looks at a recent immigrant and says, "Go home. Why don't you just go home?" You know, our Native American brothers and sisters look at us and go, "Why don't you go home?" You know, like you know, that lands a little differently when you think about it in those terms, and the, you know, the creation of the United States, and you know, we've all took American history in our, you know, in our schooling, hopefully, and the history that I was taught absolutely celebrated the European conquest of and the establishment of this great country of ours, and what a glorious conquest that was, and look at how much we've accomplished, never once mentioning the cost, the true cost of that, never once mentioning the you know, that was how I was brought up, how I was educated. How about our kids at the back of the room? Would you guys be willing to tell us what they're teaching you in high school now and junior high about American history and relative to
indigenous populations?
Has it come out that you know, the sort of the cost of that, the establishment of these populations in places like Minnesota and the Dakotas and Montana, all over the country? I mean, we can't ignore anywhere. All right.
Well, it's a very clear Northern European concept to say, this is the parameter of my farm, my land, my yard. And that is not a native way of thinking about land. The land is clearly to be used as a gift and to be used judiciously, and so we have a very different concept of land.
I think the Black Hills is, from what I know, is sacred land
It is.
to the native tribes. And it's interesting to think about Mount Rushmore being right in the middle of native land. 4 white presidents are there. Of course, one of those presidents really wanted to have sacred land, but sacred land for probably the US population, not necessarily to reserve it for native peoples.
Indeed. So I hope that you were able to hear, Scott. The Black Hills is sacred land, and there was a ceremony of bringing people of many different Lakota tribes together, representatives of tribes together, to be at the Black Hills and to do their visioning and thankfulness that they wanted to be able to express, and how by stealth the government was able to steal it away.
One of the thoughts that I've had looking at scripture in the book of Genesis, we talk about conquest. The Europeans came to North America in a conquest mode. There's a very similar story in Genesis of how Israel was established.
Yeah.
And so there's certainly a lot of historical precedent for what the Europeans did here.
There is, and I do think that there are the whole idea of what's yours, what's mine, and what is ours is very tricky when it comes to historical understanding of land. And I also think it's really, really all part of racism, where the one thing that Rebecca Clarren talks about with regard to race and this book is that the Jewish population had skin color the same as you and I. And in that way, she does this upheaval of, oh my gracious, the oppression that's going on, the stealing, the broken treaties, all of that. She said, I'm part of that. And the end, I'm only halfway through the book, for goodness sakes. And what I know at the end of this book is that she and a rabbi that she trusted entered together into a 3-year relationship of studying what the Torah says about how to repair ill-done things. And so she's a very, very intentional woman with regard to her research, her spirituality, her social consciousness, and her family history. It's all combined. It's just, did I tell you it's 2023 publication? It's literally hot off the press.
I don't know if this might resonate at all, but one of the people she interviewed was perhaps the first judge of Native descent in California, I believe.
I believe so.
And her comment as a judge was, I don't look for reparation. I look for healing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think sometimes the past cannot be repaired.
Mm-hmm.
But how can we work toward healing?
Mm-hmm.
And what would that healing mean?
And I am aware that those of us of my generation, we were taught a scripted white perspective view of history. And the perspective of the Indigenous American is way different. And to be listened to and honored. And those of us who don't understand, it's because we do come from that point of privilege. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I mean, look at the little house on the prairie books that
Yeah.
we were all raised on, you know, it takes a while to change that whole scenario.
That whole narrative, yep. And then there's the 1862 Dakota Uprising. For those who know about that, that happened right here in Minnesota. And it's very, very much a part of our history. And what's interesting about this population here is that Norwegian homesteaders were very much a part of that incident in history. And so when I say my background, for those of you who know, I'm 50% Irish, which is amazing for third generation. And Stephen, of course, is even more amazing because he's 98% Norwegian. And we, those of us Northern Europeans who came, we're all part of that. Our families got land that was not free. Peter.
What do you do with like the Ojibwe, replacing the Sioux in like this area? Like I heard that even Owasso was the area for some of the battles. So the way that the native people lived was also kind of by might is right.
I'm not qualified to answer that. Does anyone, Michael, or actually, Michael, your hand was second. Forgive me, I'm gonna go to the back.
If you look at maps before the colonies, the Indians were in totally different places. They were pushed.
Yeah,
And as they were pushed, they moved into the land of others. And so, you know, the Ojibwe or Assiniboine, weren't from Wisconsin. They weren't from farther east, but they were pushed, and all of them were.
and part of that migrating of the tribes is they were following the buffalo, they were following their food source. And so, yes, there was movement, therefore there were conflicts that happened. And Peter, what were you going to say? Oh, I'm sorry, Michael.
Well, I was gonna comment on that, Anishinaabe, Lakota battle. I worked at a small college in Wisconsin that had the highest percentage of Native students in any college in Wisconsin, probably in the country. And they had a really good Native American program. It was led by a, Ojibwe Anishinaabe person.
Okay,
And I remember her talking about that battle and just kind of joking about how they used to take a stick of dynamite and throw it down the hut of one of the Lakota people. I mean, they carry the memories of their conflict, intertribal conflicts, you know, as well as the conflict with the Europeans. But it's really, really complicated stuff. It's like, we talked about the Potawatomi. Well, I also worked with the Potawatomi over in eastern Wisconsin, the Forest Potawatomi. They were never conquered. They just got a reservation status in 1988.
whoa,
That's how this stuff is still ongoing. They just got their gaming rights in 1992. So it's still happening that the rights are being sorted out and justice is being done. But they were the keepers of the fire, and their chief was the last hereditary chief of the Potawatomi. And they kind of dispersed all over the place, but they were Algonquin speaking, East Coast, like Diane was saying. So it's really complicated stuff, and so I think the more we know, the more we realize we got a lot more to know.
right, yes.
We are always taught that we were savages
Mm.
and uncivilized,
Mhm.
but for much of the fighting between tribes, they did what was called counting coup. If they could get close enough to their enemy to touch them, that was victory. They didn't have to kill. They counted coup, and that was that. And something like scalping, they learned from the French in Canada when the French were there. So, you know, they learned from
Yeah,
the Europeans.
there was a lot
And
of.
they didn't have dynamite until the Europeans came.
Right, exactly. Thank you. I appreciate all that you're sharing. You have a good knowledge base. Now, the next topic I would like to talk with you about, or have you talk with each other about, is boarding schools. Now, the one thing that I want you to know that was, again, a learning from this book that I am currently reading. By this time, and we're talking the late 1980s, that they actually incorporated the forcing of children in order to, of course, strip them of their culture and get them into boarding schools under the Catholic Church, and cut their hair, as Pastor Peter said, and put them in their little white First Communion.
I think you meant 1890.
1890.
Yeah.
Did I say 1990?
You said
Yeah, we're gonna hold you-
1980s.
Century now. But here's what was posed to the parents. At this time, by this time, the relationship between the government and the indigenous population was they were promised food rations. And if their children did not attend the schools, those food rations were cut out. So that's what you need to know about the constant overt oppression that the government was putting on the Native population. It was a forced choice situation. So what do you know about boarding schools? And I will maybe be able to validate, and maybe I won't be able to. I'm not an expert up here. Go ahead,
I grew up in a
Chris.
small town in western Minnesota named Graceville that was established as a Catholic community. I never knew it, but there was a St. Mary's Academy there. When I was in school, there was the parochial school, the Catholic school and the public school. And the predecessor to that Catholic school that I never knew until I read it in the paper about a year ago.
Yeah.
Was an Indian school.
Wow.
Wow. And that Indian school became the Catholic school that closed when I was in high school, and then all those kids came to the public school.
I see.
And then I went to college at the University of Minnesota Morris, and that Morris campus was originally an Indian school.
Ah,
So the town I grew up in and where I went to college both have a history of having an Indian school.
thank you.
And Morris University tuition is free to Native Americans.
Mhm.
And when I was there, there were a few Native Americans there. I guess today there's a lot more. But there were some of my friends that resented the fact that Lee Staples got free tuition and books.
Yeah.
Resented that. I have to pay. Why doesn't he have to pay?
Yes, yes.
You know?
And again, it's that misunderstanding that we have as generations removed from the original atrocities. And, yeah, thank you.
Can I add on to what Chris said? So my sister
Absolutely.
just graduated this year, 2023 from Morris. And one of the things that the student body's been really fighting for is to, they believe that there are students buried there. As you know, a lot of the Canadian schools are doing with their Christian boarding schools where there's, unmarked graves everywhere. So there was one that was found during construction of a new building. And so the student body's like, well, we need to dig all of this up. Like, we need to do, right by these people. And the university was like, no, we're not doing that. We're not doing that. And there were like multiple protests. She said, and Chris is not wrong. There's a lot of the students that go to Morris are Native students. For that free tuition, but also for the community. There's Indigenous languages taught at this school that there's not available at other schools. My sister's good college roommate, that was her major, and that was the reason why she went there, so that she could keep like her grandma's heritage alive and be able to speak languages that weren't taught to her. But yeah, it's definitely still very much problematic.
And I cannot speak with any depth to what's happening in Canada and how there is the lawsuit that's going on based on the Indigenous population saying, we've been stripped of this and this and this. Jolene, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but do you know more about the history of that?
So a lot of the kids that went were taken from their communities and sent off to these Catholic boarding schools, were never returned. And so like the Catholic missionaries would come in and say, well, your kid's gonna go here for 9 months and they'll come home and then, they're going back to school. And a lot of those kids would never return. Either they were tortured to death or they, tried to run away and were caught, that kind of thing. And so they bury tons of children in unmarked graves. So throughout Canada and North Dakota, like they've just found all these like locations of these schools where like these children just never made it home. So Andrew and I went to UND, which also has a high student population of Native Americans. And one of my good friends grew up on the Turtle Mountain reservation. And she was telling me that her grandmother had attended a Catholic boarding school and just never talked about it. Like it was one of those things that you could not discuss in their house. And she's like, my grandma was open about everything. Like would tell me anything I ever wanted to know, but that was a discussion you were never to have. And like, you could not ask grandma about that. And it was like, and she also said that she thinks that her grandma was like more protective, like they could not go very far from home. And they had all these like very strict rules because it was just like this deep generational trauma that they held, that they, the government or these Catholic missionaries could just come and take your whole world apart. And that was just gonna be it.
And from the reading that I've done about the Dakota uprising in Minnesota, 1662, is that many of the generations do not know about the details of what happened and at that time. And that too is a whole nother story. It's a whole nother story that involves those of us who have, especially Scandinavian background.
Yeah, on the Dakota War, the Dakota conflict, Fort Snelling has been working on, improving their,
Fort Snelling has been trying to improve what they say about the Dakota conflict and information that's out there. I was out there a year ago with a friend of mine. I don't know if all of you know, I worked on the Navajo Reservation for 2.5 years back in the 90s, and the teacher I worked with, who was from Pennsylvania, ended up marrying a Navajo for a while. It didn't work out, but she has a son and they're in Pennsylvania, and they go back to the reservation every year during the summer months, but that's a whole other story. But she was here visiting me last year, and we went to Fort Snelling to see their displays and to walk through the fort. And you've probably all been there at some point. But I bought a book there on the Dakota conflict. It's been again fairly recently published. It's all the journals and the transcripts of people being interviewed over the years and whatnot on the Native side. And you get a whole different picture because none of that has ever been released before. And you also find out again how messy and complicated it is. That there's no one voice in the Native population, either the Dakota people, because there were those that were very strong-minded and saying, we have to push back. I mean, the whole thing started out with their food not coming that they were promised, and it was months late, and then they were having problems with that, and so then there were little conflicts, and then there was a couple of Native guys coming back that had been out hunting and couldn't find anything, and so they stole some eggs, and then there was a shooting, and then that started the whole thing, the Dakota conflict. And anyway, so there were those that wanted to fight back, those that wanted to assimilate and say, okay, we're never going to win, we're never going to get our land back, we should assimilate, make the best of it. And then there were those that had intermarried. And so you had all these different things. It's like the rest of our present racial messes that we have, there's just no one voice, and everything gets rather complicated. But so it's a very interesting book to read these different citing or different feelings about it, and their from the Native perspective, their own words. I mean, these were people who lived it and were interviewed and written down and translated, or journals or whatever. So I mean, it's not been passed. I mean, it's not interviewing people today, looking back 100 and some years. They're the ones that were actually there. So it's very interesting. And then just one other thing, I was recently in October, I had gone to the Black Hills to visit my mentor, someone who knew Kelly. Because we laughed about that when I talked with Kelly last spring, hoping to get her here. Anyway, and he spent about 15 years on the Pine Ridge as the Lutheran minister, working with the Episcopalians too in the ministry there on Pine Ridge. And he was telling me when I met with him this last month, we were talking about things, and he said that his grandparents and that family, that generation, were living in Minnesota, and some of them were killed in the Dakota conflict. And he said, growing up, they never, ever would talk about that. Never would talk about that. And if they did anything, if there were any murmurings, of course, it was all on our side. They were attacked. It was all on the Dakota side. That they were the bad guys and they were killing us, sort of thing. And then for him to go to college and learn more about history and whatnot, and then his love for Native Americans, and then and ending up working on the reservation for so many years and having good friends. It was just a total turnaround. And he was talking about how the Lakota are buying back the Black Hills 1 acre at a time. There's people that sometimes will the land to them, sometimes buy the land, but they're working at it. And there was a church in Rapid City, I think, that gave their church back to the Lakota, and then both Lakota worked out a deal with them. So it's kind of all very interesting.
Go ahead, Mike.
Got time for a story?
Sure. Can I just say as it gets up there that the University of Minnesota is starting tuition free for all Native American kids who are undergraduates or transfer students if you're a member of one of the 11 tribes in Minnesota starting fall of 2022. Yay.
Good news. Good news.
I just want to say that Carol raises something about generational influences, and in the counseling field, they talk about generational trauma and so forth. My great-great-grandfather and great-great-uncle joined the US Army in 1860, whatever, 5, 6, thinking they were going to fight the Civil War. Instead, they got sent to the Indian Wars. And my uncle Reuben, great uncle Reuben, kept a journal, a diary. And just one note from that diary. They were in an encampment out someplace in western Dakota, maybe, Wyoming. And there was they had killed a bunch of Indians that day. And that night, the commander cut the head off a couple of the Indians, put them on stakes outside the military encampment. And my great uncle Reuben was aghast at that, didn't know what to do. So he was caught up, just an ordinary guy, raised Christian, caught up in that whole thing. Fast forward. My mother grew up in South Dakota. My grandfather was a Sunday school missionary who did church planting out in the Black Hills for the Presbyterians. And I didn't know it, but at the time he was also an agriculture instructor at the Indian school in Rapid City. And they lived there in the dormitory with the other lady. And one of my mother's good friends, a girl named Ramona, they were just fast buddies. Her father was one of 4 surviving infants that was picked up on the battlefield at Wounded Knee. He later died in a jail cell where he hung himself. My mother, when my dad died, decided to take up writing, and the subject of her book was the life of Ben Black Fox, her friend's father. And she became kind of an expert on the Battle of Wounded Knee. She visited the Haskell Indian School where Ben Black Fox went. And there's the story of how the government promised so much and promised so much and promised so much. I knew she was writing that, but I didn't realize until very late, just before her death, that she was living at that Indian school with Ramona and with Ben Black Fox and all these people. I wish she was around so I could ask her those questions, but she wrote the book, and it's a really interesting book because it's complicated. There's a complicated spiritual history too, and how the Lakota were forbidden from practicing their own practices. This was, you could not do it. The dances and everything. Well, in the course of writing this book, my mom went through those rituals out in South Dakota. She was at Pine Ridge during the uprising. She actually drove Dennis Banks to the airport one day. But anyway, she wrote the book. It's not a very good book, but it's there. I've got the manuscript. It's the story.
Isn't it amazing how much we can just learn from each other? And so small things. Toni, thank you for your willingness to step in today. It's so grateful you picked up that book. And you need to finish it so you can tell us how it ended. Steve, you had a really insightful comment earlier where you talked about how to, what would healing look like in this fractured relationship we have with our Native brothers and sisters. And I don't have the quick answer to that, but I think I've shared this anecdote previously, but I want to leave you with this today, and that is about 10 years or so ago, maybe even a little longer than that, there was a fledgling congregation forming amongst, on the Rocky Boy Indian Reservation in Montana, northeastern Montana, close to the Canadian border up on the High Line there, and just a very desolate corner of the state. And it's not a very big reservation. But there was a small Lutheran congregation that was forming, or had been there, but was struggling. And then finally they got a leader, and as he started caring for that community, he recognized that just, you know, the power, embedded power in having people come and participate and honor them with presence to come and be there. And Jessica Christ was the Bishop of Montana at the time, and through her, they extended an invitation to the presiding bishop of the Lutheran Church at the time, was Mark Hansen, and extended an invitation. Would Mark come to the Rocky Boy Indian Reservation in Montana? And he said yes, and that was the only place he came on that trip. He honored them by just being singularly focused with them, and then he arrived, and of course they had, you know, celebration with, you know, like a visiting dignitary, right, and drum circles, and, you know, and all kinds of pageantry that the native put on for him to welcome him and make him feel there. And then they had a worship service, and of course Mark was, you know, invited to bring the word into that moment. And you can hear him getting choked up. He couldn't. I mean, he got up and was so moved by them and their story of this reservation and their story of these people and their ancestors. Couldn't. But instead, he got down on his knees and he washed the feet of all the elders.
Oh my God.
If there's a pathway to healing that Steve talks about, I think it begins there. On our knees, washing the feet of those whom we've harmed, who we've troubled, and to own up to our own story. I don't know why that's so emotional for me, but it's powerful, so powerful. And he didn't have to preach after that. That was all that was talked about. That was all that was in the news. And then a few years later, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, picked up on that idea. He'd been doing it as well, and he has gotten well known for at certain times washing the feet of prisoners and washing the feet of immigrants and refugees and in our midst. And what an act! This is the church. The church gets down on its knees and washes feet. That's who we are. Amen. Thank you.